I've fixed computers that no one else will, by username begforanegg. I knocked on a door and waited. In any line of work that involved going to people's houses, you quickly realise that it takes a while for the person on the other side to stop whatever they're doing and come and answer. I've been told about this specific house and how no one on the team wanted to go there, and how it was one of the most dangerous by far, though no specific reason was ever given. Right, anyway, sorry, I should probably explain myself. I work for a tech support company. Yes, an actual tech support company. And my job consists of going to people's houses, plugging what I like to call the magic stick into the broken computer, and letting it do its work. Now, you see, unlike the other members of the team, I don't actually have any background in computer security or any sort of technological science. I actually majored in psychiatry. You see, I wanted to be a therapist, but it didn't turn out so well. I do, however, have an infinite pool of luck, seemingly, because I managed to ace an interview for a job that pays well. Granted, I'm not qualified for it, but it is incredibly easy. Here comes the downside, however. Due to the fact that my knowledge on computers is so limited that I have to take, how do I say this kindly, the more dangerous jobs? Usually it's something like cults, cryptids, cults of cryptids, and anything in between. I am, however, paid extra for taking these jobs, and also probably to keep my mouth shut about them. Of course, I'm guessing, as it's unlikely they include talk to anyone and we'll see how many limbs you wake up with in the contract, but it is heavily implied. Now, where was I? Oh yes, the job that I was talking about now. The house was 2 stories tall and a greyish colour. It stood in the middle of nowhere, effectively, and it stood out pretty strongly against the dense forestry surrounding it. So I was standing there for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly the door swung open, and what looked like to be a young woman, if I had to guess her age I would say, mid-20s, stood just past the doorframe. Immediately, she grabbed my arm and pulled me into the house and hurriedly slammed the door behind me. Oh, great, it's one of those, I thought to myself. Well, the job pays well enough, so what can you do? Immediately, I noticed the blue tattoo on the side of her neck. Now, it seemed to look like an eye, but I'm now not so sure. Maybe? Anyway, she grabbed my arm again and led me to a room in the back of the house on the 1st floor. Next thing I know, she threw me in and slammed the door behind me. For a moment, I didn't move from next to the door, and I looked around, worried that there might be something else in here. But after a moment of silence, I relaxed and looked around me. There was an old-style computer in the middle of the room on an old wooden desk. The room wasn't very big, but it was big enough for me to be able to walk around the desk. I inspected the wires, presumably connecting to a power source, that just ran along the desk, onto the floor and into the ceiling. Other than that, the room was empty. One window on the wall with a lot of natural light flooding in and white walls. Pretty average, which, weirdly enough, put me on edge. It is never a good sign when the danger is not immediately noticeable. I sat in front of the computer and pressed the on button, seeing the powering on screen followed by a picture from a cave onto a beach. Oh, the computer ran Windows 10 for something that looked so fucking old, it was truly a surprise. But I digress, I have a job to do, and the sooner I get out of here the better. So I searched the computer for a moment to find an available USB slot, and upon finding one I fished out the magic stick from my pocket and plugged it straight in. A small light lit up orange on the stick to say that it was working, so I got up, took my bag over to the corner, and I sat down. Here's a little tip from me to you. When you're doing this job, never, and I mean never, sit in front of the screen while it's working. Best case scenario, the light on the stick switches to green to show that it's finished and you can leave. Worst case scenario, much more common, can be anything ranging from the screen literally exploding and spraying you with glass to something worse, like something trying to climb out of the fucking computer, Ring style. Now, it's not my job to deal with anything that crawls out. That is the problem of either my company or the person who lives here. Yeah, to be honest, it depends who arrives first, really. As I'm starting to wonder about what could possibly be so bad about this house, the woman from before stands in the open doorway, staring at the computer with wide eyes. I shuffle about a bit and I start bringing my bag up to my lap so I can grab my hammer if needed, and if not, I can also grab some lunch. The stick can take anything from an hour all the way up to a full day, so I usually bring along a lunch and some money in case it lasts even longer. Usually if it takes longer than 3 days, it means I'm going to be here all day. Slowly, her gaze turns from the computer to me, and then back to the computer before she slams the door shut. And I listen to her footsteps disappear down the hall and double, while coming back down. The door swings open and my hand tightens on the hammer in my bag, but loosens when I realise there's another person with her. It was another young woman with the same tattoo on her neck. Awesome. It's a cult. The door shuts and once again their footsteps go up to the hallway and come down doubled. The door yet again swings open and reveals twice the people. All young women with the same neck tattoo. This continues happening until the entirety of what I can see from the doorway seems to be filled with wide-eyed young women who seem completely bewildered by both my presence and the computers. As much as I wanted to ask questions, I learnt pretty quickly that usually cults don't have answers you're looking for. Another thing I noticed about the cult was that they were all wearing the same thing, what looked to be a hospital gown of sort. Nothing too spooky really, but they all looked back and forth from me to the computer. None dared entered the room, as if something seemed like the one in front was actually preventing the other ones from entering. I didn't mind them at all really, coming to watch me work, and I just chalked it up as some explainable quirk of an otherwise normal cult. Well, as normal as a group of young women in hospital gowns can be. I decided that it was probably best if I left for a moment, in case anything that could kill me happened. Plus, I really needed to piss. I grabbed my bag and walked to the doorway, noting how as far as I could see the entire hall was filled with these women. I shuffled my way past the first few, and excused my way through the last few, all of them staring at me with bewildered eyes before going back to staring towards the doorway, almost like they're lining up. Once I made it back to the front door, I opened it and immediately hear several pairs of footsteps travelling through the house towards me. I quickly hop out and go to shut it, but not before seeing a woman turn the corner in the house just past the doorway, baring her teeth at me and sprinting. I shut the door and hurriedly go back to my van, looking back and seeing women staring at me from the windows of the house. All the windows. Nothing really noteworthy happens in the next 20 minutes. I finally take a piss at a nearby diner and have my lunch before returning to the house, mostly just to retrieve the stick so I can prove I actually did my job. Something my manager seems to try his hardest to prove wrong. However, the thing about the stick is that it seems to somehow have proof on it of every time I fix something. I don't entirely understand it honestly, but that's to be expected. When I returned to the house, it was completely different. The windows were boarded up, but not with wood or anything like that. It was almost a pale white colour. The materials covered the window frame perfectly. It seemed to be on the outside of the windows as well. The material also seemed to have a few patches of brown on it. I walked up to the door and knocked. The door slowly swung open. I reasoned with myself for a second before deciding to step in and make my way towards the computer room. Now, surprisingly, cults aren't very nice to intruders, so I grasped my hammer and held it close to my side as I slowly and quietly traversed the house. You know, it seems insane that I would even enter, but I had seen worse and I really, really needed this paycheck. I also examined the walls on my way, noticing how occasionally there'd be teeth or hair coming off the wall, as if it was part of it. To be fair, this was pretty typical cult behaviour, honestly. Nothing too out of the cult ordinary. But as soon as I turned the corner that took me to the hall that led to the computer room, I noticed something was off. First of all, the computer room at the end was incredibly dark, as the window in there must have been boarded off too, but the same material that boarded up the windows now covered the walls, and seemed to be slowly but surely continuing outwards and covering more of the floor and wall. That's when I heard a crunching sound coming from the room. It was rhythmic and sounded like someone eating chicken, bones and all. I walked down the hall and noted the material on the floor was now squishy and soft. All the more reason not to touch it and to get out of here quickly. I stopped at the doorway. The room was full of the young girls from earlier, all crammed into this dark room, and occasionally when the rhythmic crunching sound stopped, they all moved a step and it continued. This didn't really ring any alarms. A lot of cults will dance around some object of worship. No, what really worried me was the sound and how loud it was. It was almost unbearable. I stepped in, being completely ignored by the sea of women, and I made my way towards the stick. I had to wait before the sound had stopped for me to push through the last few of them towards the desk, where there was a small clearing towards the front of it, and on the screen was a set of normal human teeth, with gums framing the sides. Great! Glad to see the stick was probably now finished, thank God. I looked down and grabbed the stick from the computer, but when I stood back up and slowly put the stick back into my pocket, the crowd shifted once again. I watched the nearest woman in front of the computer come forward and reached forward with her head to the screen as if she was going to kiss it. As I watched, and to my absolute surprise, the teeth on the screen opened, and when her head reached them, oh Jesus, thinking about it, her head should have been stopped by the small layer of glass. But that isn't what happened. Her head went into the screen, like fully into the screen, into the bloody mouth of the fucking computer. The teeth came down onto her head and went completely through. Her body falling limp on the desk as half her head was fucking consumed, and a loud noise continued. I suddenly realised what the noise was. The mouth on the screen devouring all these young women. I stood frozen as I also realised that the pale material was their skin, and their teeth and hair. And as I stood there, the woman behind the body lifted the legs up and continued to feed her own body to the monitor, the crunching sound continuing, and slowly her body disappearing into the awaiting more. I quickly pushed through the crowd, elbowing a couple of people on the way out, but was met with no resistance. I made my way out and into the hallway. I ran through the house, a feeling of abject sickness in my stomach growing as I realised there was more teeth and more hair on the walls as I left, and when I reached the door, I grasped the door handle and I almost screamed. It squished under my grasp. The door handle squished. It was an eyeball. It was a fucking eyeball. I gritted my teeth and twisted it, and the door opened. Pieces of skin tearing as the door frame had been covered on the outside with the stuff. I ran to my van and looked back at the house as I opened the door. One window hadn't been covered. It was an upstairs window, and in it I could vaguely make out a face on the ceiling of the room. No, it wasn't on the ceiling. The face wasn't on the ceiling. No, it was in the ceiling. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. The eyes suddenly looked right at me through the distant window, and a smile slowly crept onto its face before its mouth opened, and a person, probably another cultist, jumped in and was caught halfway through by the mouth clamping down, her lower half falling to the floor and blood splattering all over from what I could see of the room from the bottom of the lawn. I quickly climbed into my car and left. I didn't look back, and I knew my boss wasn't going to believe me on this one. When I got back to headquarters, I went up to my boss and I explained the situation, what had happened, and I handed him the USB stick as proof. To my surprise, he simply shrugged, and he said it was probably a trick of the light before he went into his office. I was left with no explanation for the hell on earth I had just seen, and I got ready to pack up my stuff. I got back into my van to go home, hoping that was the last I'd ever see of that building. Which was made even more of a shock when I woke up one night and looked out of my window, only to see across from mine a slightly paler shade than it already was.